Welcome everyone, it's Neil here from 3D Tutor, and today we're back with another complete guide. And this one has to be one of my favourite, a stylized Skyrim style dungeon scene. And if you're interested in how long this scene took and what our thoughts are on how difficult the scene was to put together, then stay to the end where we'll give you a complete breakdown of how long each section took and what skill level you might need in each of the software. This scene comes as always with its own packed Blender file, complete with all textures and models as you see here. But best of all, actually, in this pack we've also included a separate Unreal Engine file, so far more stuff you can download. Links to everything are down below, and this of course will be great for you as you can see exactly how the scene was created. And before I forget, we're actually creating a new course, and this course will be based around this theme, a complete dungeon modular kit. So let us know in the comments if this is something you're interested in, and all of these packs are available on Gumroad and are free along with all of our courses and complete guides to all of our Patreon members. That's 300 hours of content for the price of a cup of coffee, so be sure to check those out. Every Tuesday and Thursday we'll be releasing more complete guides, so please subscribe and click on the bell to get notified of our next release. If you want your idea featured in one of our scenes, then drop your comments down below. We really would love some great ideas from you guys. Finally, all of the techniques you see here are covered in our massive library of over 20 courses and 200,000 downloads, so be sure to check those out as well. But enough of all that. What you're here for is the complete guide, so let's get started on our stylized Skyrim style dungeon scene. So the first part is going to be the modelling section, and I had a pretty clear idea of what I actually wanted to create and what the aesthetic should actually be. As you've seen in my previous work, my favourite art style has to be ESO type Skyrim art style, so that's what we're going to go with. So here you can see, just brought in a cube, and the first thing I'm going to do is actually create the walls. So there's a technique that I normally do to create walls, which is in one of the actual videos on the 3D Tutor channel, and you can check out the links down below for that. But you can see pretty much what I'm using is a modifier stack, and I'm using that displace to actually displace the actual mesh using a subdivision. Finally then I'm beveling it off, and then I'm going to use something called weighted normals just to bring that back. Now at the moment it was a little bit too small, as you saw, but what I did was I made it a little bit bigger, and now you can see it looks really nice. Then what I can do is I can join the mesh to another mesh and basically inherit all of those actual modifiers. So that's basically what I'm doing now. Now what I'm doing is I'm actually going to cut the top of it just to add a little bit of flair and a bit more artistic style to it, and I basically use the knife tool, cut it down, bridge the edge loops, and now actually I'm just having a look to see if it actually looks right. And you can see it's a really good technique actually of getting that broken wall effect. Just pulling it up now, making sure that it's all actual the right height and things, because I know I need to actually put a door in here, so that's what we're doing now. And finally then I'm just going to reset all of the transformations, set the origin, and then that will give me a perfect wall. Now I'm doing is I'm actually creating the boolean for the actual door, so I'm going to put this here, then I'm going to bring in a modifier boolean, cut a hole in the actual wall as you can see there, and then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use that actual boolean that I've just done to create the actual stonework around the wall. You can see there that I used even thickness, solidify, and then offset it a little bit, and that made it really easy then just to put it halfway between. Now what I'm trying to do here is just work out how I actually want the stonework to actually look. So what I'm doing is I'm just pulling the parts out that I want to, and then I'm going to split them off like you can see now. Make them a little bit smaller, fill in the holes, so mesh, clean up, fill holes, bring in a bevel, bring them closer together, and there you go, you can see we can make really nice stonework that way. Now I'm doing is I'm actually going to create a door. You can see here I'm thinking how best to do this, and in the end I go with just pulling it down and I flatten it out at the bottom. Now I'm not sure at this point how many actual planks I actually want, so I'm just checking out whether that's going to be enough, whether I'm happy with the thickness of the planks. I'm thinking it's not really going to go, so what I did was I brought in another cylinder, brought down the amount of vertices, and now I'm going to do the same thing, bring it down, and then just making sure that the planks are going to look fine. Then I use the bisect tool just to cut away that bottom part, and now that I'm happy with it I can pull it out and actually start work on the rest of it. So what I'm doing now is the actual hole where, you know, the prisoners can actually look through, and now I'm carrying on with the planks, pulling them out. Now I've actually booleaned the hole there, and just getting the planks right. I could have gone in actually and made the planks a bit wobbly, a bit more uneven, but I'm thinking this has to be a really sturdy door, so perhaps the only worn thing is probably going to be underneath, where prisoners might be, you know, putting their hands under or something like that, just to wear away that wood. But apart from that, I'm thinking maybe the wood wouldn't have warped that much. So that's what I'm always thinking about when I'm actually creating things like this. So now we're putting in just the bars, as you can see, and then I'm just trying to get it all to come together and make it a little bit thinner, because it was a little bit too thick, the door. We want it to be sturdy, but we don't want it looking like a tank can't even drive through or something like that. Now I'm just using edge loops just to create those kind of edges on this actual peephole, and basically I'm using that then to actually put some bolts in there to make it look really sturdy. Now I was really happy actually with these hinges and the arms that go on the hinges, how I actually did this. So it was really nice technique and gave me the really nice look that I'm actually going for, which is that type of stylized but realist look what Skyrim actually has. So that's what we're going for then. Now the bolts and things like that, you could actually create these in Substance Painter, so you could use the normal map and put those on, but I wanted it to look a little bit more realistic, and plus I wanted some light to actually bounce off them, so I chose instead to actually bring in my own bolts. It will add up to probably a couple of thousand or extra polygons, but in this case I wanted it to actually look really nice, so that's why we went and did that. I recommend though, if you're going through it for a game and things like that, that perhaps you might want to just create those in Substance Painter. Now I wasn't sure about the actual lock on here. It's one of the things that I'm probably least happy with in the whole build. You will find as you build things out that you are going to be unhappy with certain things, and the actual lock was one of the things that I think if I had a bit more time would have paid a bit more attention to, and probably redone it if I'm honest. So now I'm just creating this actual bolt that looks like it's been hammered into a wall, and then the keys are going to be actually put on there. So you can see there I'm actually using a curve to create those handle for the keys. And now you can see a very simple technique where you're basically just adding edge loops, pulling out, inserting, pulling out again, and then basically bringing in a subdivision surface, bringing in more edge loops then, and what you end up with is a nice straight actual key with a little bit of roundness on it. That's exactly the look you're going for. You can see there as well, the keys are pretty chunky. That's the thing as well that I'm going for here. I want to make things a little bit more chunky than real life, as that is the art style of kind of ESO and things. The actual humans in there, they're a little bit more chunky. Not quite as chunky as World of Warcraft, but still a little bit more chunky. Alright, so now I'm trying to work out where is this bolt going to go, just trying to fit everything together, putting my locking mechanism in there as you can see, and then just pulling the handles down. Now I just bring on in cavities, so you can see it looks a little bit different now, and I always do this because it gives me a really good feel of how things are going to look once they're actually beveled off, once they've actually got materials and things like that on them. So now we move into the kind of torture chamber part of this. And I can see there that these probably chains, I need to make sure that they're chunky enough but not like over the top or anything like that. Now I'm creating the little hands that, the wrist straps that hold the prisoner in place. You can see there I'm using proportional editing just to bring that in, using solidify just to bring them out where I want them. I'm not actually applying that solidify modifier yet because I'm just getting in the shape that I want to before I actually apply that. And then once I apply that, then I can start messing around with the mesh and bringing it out like that. It just makes it really easy for me. Again on here, as you can see, I'm trying to get the light to bounce off these really nicely, so I'm actually creating my own bolts. As I say, we'll add up to a few polygons extra in the end, but for now I'm actually happy with it. So here you can see I actually sharpened the edges there because I know that I want the rest of the chains to be very smooth. I don't want any hard edges on them, so I'm only actually using the sharp on the bottom of them. So now I'm just mirroring it over, looking how far apart they are. I've got my guy there, as you can see, just measuring the distance. His hands are up in the air. And now what I need to do is bring this down. I need to make it look as though somebody's been hanging there, so you can see there, make it drop down a little bit in the middle. And now I'm looking to do is make sure that this actually looks as though it can stand up on its own and it's very strong. And if someone's actually chained up here, they're not going to escape. Alright, so same again with the bolts. I'm making my own bolts and then bolting that to the floor, and you can see already it looks pretty sturdy. One thing you can see, the issue there is that the actual links that hold the wrists, they're way too small at the moment, and I do go in and fix these and make them much more chunkier. I actually put them to the guy's arm there, as you can see, but that is a realistic, atomically correct reference, so I need to make those a bit bigger to make it a little bit more stylized. Alright, so now moving on to the favourite part of the actual build, which was the actual torch. And this is a really good technique if you're creating your own torch. I bring in a plane, I bring in a curve, I delete all the vertices, and then actually I use my grease pencil to actually create that curve. And you can see here the effect you get. I'm solidifying it, make Alt S to actually make the actual part smaller, getting rid of some of the vertices that don't actually look right, smoothing it all out, as you can see. And once I've actually turned this around, you'll see exactly how this looks. I'm really happy with how this turned out. So I'll delete that plane now, solidify those parts. I'm working out now how many 360 degrees, if I have 8 points on there, how many degrees is it going to be each one. So a bit of math there, bring them in, get rid of those because they don't actually look right anyway. And I'm going to put a bottom on, as you can see, so I might as well get rid of some polygons. And now let's bring in the torch and make sure that it actually fits, as you can see. Rounding the top off there, that's where the actual flame's going to go. So I'm thinking all the time, what is going to hold the torch? What would they hold? So it would be some like points or something. They'll just slide the torch in, points would grab it, and that would just hold it, and they'd also be able to pull it out like so. Just got to make sure as well that you have a handle on here, because they would need to grab hold of something. Normally it would be a metal handle, not wood. Now making them a little bit smaller. I'm just trying to get it fit all into place. And you can see here it's a little bit too big. I mean, we're going for stylized, but not crazy over the top stylized. So, alright, so now I'm just bringing it against the wall, bringing out that metal handle, and now I need to bring in the part that's actually going to hold it. So while I've got it near the wall, I might as well measure everything up. I don't want it just to be a flat base, I want to actually make it a little bit ornate. So I'm just bringing it in, bending everything around, just getting a really nice style actually that I'm happy with. It wouldn't be too ornate, just so you're aware of that. It might be in the King's Chamber or something like that. Or as far as the dungeon goes, they're going to make a lot of these. The blacksmith will make a lot of these. So it needs to be something, just a simple, really design like you see here. So now I'm just pulling that down, pulling it out, and of course I need something that's a stopper that's going to actually support the actual torch. And of course we need some bolts in the wall to make sure it looks real, to make sure it all looks as though it's actually bolted together and able to hold that torch, because it's a fairly big torch. Probably would have fairly big torches as well, because they need to burn for a long time. There's no way they would want the the prison in darkness or anything like that. Again, using the bolts to actually instead of using them in Substance Painter, again that's because of the light. I want the torch light to actually shine on those bolts. And I'm just bringing it in the other side once I'm actually happy with the torch. Alright, so I tend to bounce around a little bit, so now I'm moving on to the actual outer edges to get that in, because it gives me a better feel of how much depth, how many things I need to put in the scene just to make it come alive and things like that. Now you can see I'm actually making those bigger, and you can see just how much better they actually look. So back to the outer rim. Probably in hindsight, I might have made these a little bit too big, and they might have looked better when they're small. You see, I had to go around and grab all those, but instead of that, I just used Circle Select just to grab the outer faces, and that made it much easier to grab them all. And now I'm just beveling them off, making sure they're all the right size. I was thinking there where I should delete the bottoms, but then I'm thinking, well, I don't know where people are going to use them if they do download this pack, so I'm better off probably leaving the bottoms, which is what I do. Now pretty much I'm going in, beveling everything off on the door, cleaning everything up, and getting it ready for the next actual part. And you can see though already that Skyrim kind of feels really coming through. So now I'm working on the stool. You can see there I've got it, so it's very chunky, because it would be chunky. Stools are normally chunky in medieval times anyway. And now what I'm doing is I'm making the leg. I pull it out one way by a little bit of an angle, and then pull it out the other way a little bit, and you can see then we get that nice angle that looks as though it's supported. Now the problem with stools is, you can see there, it's halfway between each of the planks, and you don't really want that. What you actually want to do is make a support of some kind, so that it actually looks like it's being supported. You can see there though, one block of wood wouldn't look realistic, looks a little bit modern, so they probably would have used 2 blocks and then supported with another block in between. Because remember, it's not metal or anything like that they would have been using. It would have been probably wood. These stalls probably would have been changed a lot, fixed a lot, things like that. So not something it would have tied up the blacksmith with, I don't think. He might have made the bolts for it, but I don't think he would have made, you know, the things that hold it all together, basically. So now I'm just checking where the bolts are going to go. You can see they're a little bit out, but in the end I'm actually happy with how that turned out. So now I'm moving on to a fresh blender file. I sometimes do this if I'm creating things like, you know, little assets that are going along the side. So in here I'm creating an actual barrel. I'm actually trying out a new technique here. So just to get the look that I'm actually going for, I want a kind of chunky barrel that you would find in Skyrim or ESO. So that's what we're going for here. Just pulling out the tops of that barrel, beveling them off a little bit. And you can see already we've got that nice chunky feel that we're actually looking for. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to actually just get the right shape and then move to the top of it, where I'm actually going to create planks of wood on the top as well. So a lot of fiddling about on this barrel actually, probably spend too long on it. Sometimes you do, sometimes you get, you know, involved, and when you're trying out new techniques and things like that, you can see now I'm splitting it all off, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to solidify it, and there we go, just to make it all fit together. And now we're just going to probably come to the top, I think, in a minute. Yeah, there we go, there's the 2 tops. Pressing J, so I'm selecting each vertex, pressing J, just to get us an actual edge loop going in, bringing it up, bring them in, and then just randomizing them a little bit, making them a little bit rougher, so you can see they've got that really, really nice style that we're going for. Now I'm just going to start working on these, moving those around, just so they're a little bit uneven again. And now let's move on to the actual crates. So crates can be pretty easy. Now first of all, I did go for very simple crates where I just brought that in. In the end though, I actually changed this because it looked a little bit too modern. You can see there those edges as they come together. That's more of a modern way of actually building them. So I would say an old style way is the one we go with, where it's like chunks of wood and they kind of bolted together, as you'll see a bit later on. But all I'm doing now is I'm working on the sides, making them a little bit uneven, like so. Using my x-ray so I can see through there to see what they look like, beveling them off, and now again I'm coming back to them, just having a look, and now I'm thinking, alright, I'll create the bigger actual crate first, and then I'll take a look at them and decide whether I need to change this, because I knew like partway through building this that yeah, it's probably not the right way to do this, but I know crates are quite easy. So you can see that I'm just making that a lot more chunkier, and I know once I've got this you know, this barrel nailed down, that the crates, then I can make them look, you know, very similar to them. So now what I'm doing is I'm just going through and naming everything, and now I'm just going to UV unwrap it. And what you probably don't see here is I've probably sent it through to Substance Painter just to give it a quick test to see what it actually looked like. And now you can see I've decided, right, I'm going to change that. I need to put in some, you know, planks of wood instead. Make it look a bit more chunky looking. And definitely once I'd done this and I put it at the side of the barrels, you can see they fitted it so much better. So it really was worth actually making that change. So now you can see I'm just grabbing those, bending them round, spinning them round so they go together. And as I say, crates are pretty easy to create. So now we're just putting the corners in. And you can see sometimes why it's better to actually make a fresh blend file and then to send them through to your other one. What I normally do if I'm doing this, I will have the blend file up on my other screen so that I can have actually got a reference point to work with, but it just kind of clears the area. Now I'm thinking with crates that they are going to be hammered in, you know, repeatedly and then taken out. So that's why we actually used not actually a sphere, and instead opted to use a ecosphere instead, which gives you a bit more chunkiness on there. Plus there's a little bit less polygons as well, because I knew these crates would have a lot of polygons on them. So Just checking out now using the x-ray, making them a bit longer, putting it all together. And then of course I've got to go in then and do all my UVs again. Unfortunately there I couldn't figure out why that was black and the rest of it was white. And what I needed to do actually was clear my custom split normals, which is what is on the geometry, on the little triangle on the right hand side there. And once I cleared those, then they went the right colour. No idea why that happened. Not sure if it's a bug or not, but it fixed it. Sometimes when I get a file through from Luke, actually I'll come in and parts of the mesh will be black. I just go in, I press tab and then repress tab again, and then it appears the right colour. So I'm not sure why that's happening. So now I'm just doing the final checks on the barrel and the actual crates, making sure I'm happy with them. I'm going to go in then, reset all the transforms orientations, and then you can see there I'm just re-unwrapping everything and now bringing them into the actual scene, making them the right size. And I'm just going to go in, check all the normals, shift N if you want to turn around your normals. And you must make sure that you do that, because if you send it through to Unreal Engine or Substance Painter or even ZBrush, you're going to have massive problems with not being able to see through the mesh and all kinds of things like that. You can see there they're all black, as I said, and I just worked out where it was, clear custom split normals, and then they're all back to normal. Just smooth shading everything now, making sure that everything's auto smoothed off where I actually need it. And there you go, you can see pretty much now it's really starting to come together, and we've really got that Skyrim feel that we're actually going for. So now I'm just going in, making sure everything's named so that when you guys get this pack, everything's named and in the right collections and things like that. But more importantly actually, when Luke actually gets this, that he can actually come in and send things out easily. You must make sure if you're working in a company or studio that you get used to naming everything, all the materials are named correctly, everything's the right collection. And also one of the most important things is making sure your scale is correct. So before you begin anything, bring in a human reference or something like that to make sure everything's scaled properly. If you don't do that, you're going to have massive problems down the line with things like physics or flames or water. Anything like that's going to cause you problems. And if you're working in a pipeline with many people, the last thing someone wants is to get one of your assets and it's either way too small or way too big, and they have to rescale everything, because it really does affect everything. It's also really important if you're actually doing any animations and things like that. So you can see now everything's actually named correctly, everything's put in its own groups, so it can be unwrapped in its own groups. I think we use 5 or something texture maps on here, and then they can be sent through to Substance Painter, and it's very easy then for Lou to go through each one of them. He's got 5 materials, which equates basically to 5 texture maps. Really easy to texture everything. Alright everyone, so I hope you enjoyed that part of it, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks a lot, bye bye.
In order to start the texturing process for this environment, I just brought an entire FBX file for all the assets at once, just so I could texture everything and just get an overall kind of a feel for all the textures all at once within the same environment. Right now I'm just generating all the masks, the ambient occlusion curvature maps, just to help me out when I'm going to be using smart masks in order to bring out some of the shapes. And I'm making sure that all of them are properly set up. So what I'm doing is I'm just testing out how they're being baked. Since I'm using low poly as high poly for the bakes, I'm just basically overlaying the same kind of mesh. I have to make sure that they're properly set up. So I baked them out in 512 resolution and realized that the wall is not going to look just as well. So what I did was I just increased the ray distance, and that gave me a different result, and I just used a different ray distance on that wall specifically, which seemed to have fixed the issue, the artifacts for it. So after I was happy with the way the bakes ended up, I just went around and played with the base of the mesh, just trying to figure out what sort of a kind of foundation I want for this scene and environment. I obviously want a kind of a gritty look, since this is the type of environment I'm working with. It's kind of a prison scene, so or more like a torture room. So I wanted to make sure that everything is stylized around this kind of a gritty look. So I'm just mixing up, blending in all the dirt and concrete textures just to get kind of a noise at the bottom. I will be changing that in the future, because right now, even looking at it at the moment, it looks way too noisy and it just doesn't give you any type of a detail out of it, and it just doesn't look quite as right. but that's going to be more obvious when I'm going to be finished up texturing more of this asset. So right now I'm texturing the door. I'm just trying to get the feel for it and trying to figure out how it's going to look like together with the arc. So I'm using obviously kind of darkish textures just to again blend in with this kind of gritty look. And I already have the kind of smart material set up, so it was really nice and simple to just apply them. I masked out the object pieces, and with the help of some curvature masks as well as ambient occlusion generator masks, I was able to bring out the entire shape for the tanks, for example, by just kind of highlighting the edges. So by doing that, I was able to get some nice results. I also used a bit of warping just to kind of break apart that mask on the edges, and again to highlight the grittiness, giving that bit of an extra noise just to make sure that they don't look quite as smooth on the edges. So once I was happy with that, I continued on playing around with the base. I wasn't quite happy with the way it was turning out. I was just trying to experiment with different patterns and how I'm overlaying masks for like dirt and whatnot, just to get nicer kind of results. In the end though, I think I went with bricks because that just looked way nicer for this kind of a scene. I did want to have that kind of an extra noise just to make the scene a little bit looking more chaotic. So for example, the wall is broken off and everything, it just makes it look like this place is a total kind of a mess and somewhat abandoned even. So I just wanted to keep up with that kind of a setting. So right now I'm texturing the stool. The stool uses the same kind of wood that the door is using, but I lightened it up just a little bit just to make sure it kind of doesn't blend in with the rest of the textures for the environment. But also I wanted to keep that gritty look, so I just made sure that the grain is being quite visible, but I didn't use the item formation for that texture map just as much. I actually lowered that down by a little bit just to smoothen up the stool a little bit. And afterwards, after that, I went ahead and realized that the metal isn't looking quite as nice. So I was thinking about adding new detail, and I figured the nicest way to add more detail would be just to get more rust out of this kind of metal. So I just added a rust material real quick, and I was just playing around with what kind of extra detail I can add. So right now I'm just thinking of adding some screws, or more like some bolts on the sides of the lanterns. I'm texturing those lanterns as two separate ones because I want to have some bit of a more type of a gory look on the inside of that torture chamber. So the lantern that's outside, I'd like to keep it more casual looking, and so I'll be ending up kind of bloodying up the torch inside, so it would make it look like it's being bashed around. But right now, because I'm doing that and because I'm texturing them separately, I had to manually stamp in the bolts for both of them, and I just had to make sure that they are around the same area. And after I was happy with that, I just used an anchor point for that height channel just to highlight the edges of those bolts using another mask and just bring in that bolt right up. And once I was happy with that, I obviously needed to get an upper section of that lantern, of that torch, to be a different color. We don't want it to be metal, so I overlaid a quick fill layer and just added some noise to it just to make sure that it looks like it would be flaming from the top. I made sure that the roughness though is set to 1, just so it wouldn't give us any of reflectivity from the lights that we're later going to be placing up. So after that, I ended up playing around with the wall a little bit. The curvature masks were real nice. I ended up using a curvature map as well as a cavity mask, and just blending those two together just to get more detail out of those rocks and just to bring them up their shape outside of their just geometry. So it's somewhat a little bit stylized because I'm not only using height map to just kind of bump them in, I'm also just kind of darkening up the edges to really bring out the shape. And once I was happy with that, I just moved on and continued the texturing process. The other areas, I was just reusing the materials that I set up for like the door and the stool, just to get more consistency as well as just to make it easier for myself. So once I was happy with that, I wanted to blend in some of dirt that's just laying around in the area, and I use a dirt generator for that, which is really nice to just get some extra detail out of your level, especially when it's just using a single UV texture map. If I was to be making a larger asset, a larger map, obviously we wouldn't be able to do that because we'd be using more of a seamless textures, and something like vertex painting would be done in the engine itself. But right now, since it's a small scene, just having a single UV map, it just works fine. So afterwards I ended up doing some texture work for the crates. I was trying to figure out what type of material I want to try to get them, and I really liked the default kind of material that I was using for the wood, but obviously we can't have the frame of those crates to be looking exactly the same as the planks that are covering up these crates. So what I ended up doing is I ended up lowering the height information as well as normal information and made sure that they're set up with the blend mode to be set as normal, and that way when I was lowering the opacity on them separately, I was able to smoothen out those kind of additional bumps that we were getting out of them. But we still kept that texture, just smoothened out a little bit. And to finish it off, I just ended up adjusting the color tone using an overlay a little bit just to kind of lighten up the entire color. So it was quite fast to get those crates and barrels out of the way, and after I was happy with those crates, I ended up playing around with the terrain itself just a little bit more. I didn't like how it looked, but I wasn't sure what to add just yet, and instead what I decided was I'll just add some unique detail onto the level right now as is. And obviously, because it's a torture room, we need to add some gore onto it, so adding some blood will work quite well for the scene. So to start it off, I didn't want to have much of a blood coming out from the outside of the chamber. So what I did was, instead of just applying all the blood around the area just randomly, I just got some blood coming from underneath the door instead, and just having some drips coming around from the edges, just to again make it look like it's part of a torture chamber. But I didn't want to overdo it, obviously, so that's why I just kept it minimum to the very front of that door. But on the other side though, I wanted to bloody it up like an actual gory kind of a look, so I ended up just getting a lot of drip and blood covering the sides of the door, the frame and everything. So maybe someone like battered their head against the side edge of the frame or something of the sort. This is all done to kind of tell a bit of a story through the environment and its assets. And after I was happy with that, I wanted to add something at the top of the door. I didn't want it to make it kind of notable or distinguishable, a certain logo or something. So what I did was I just mixed up the two alpha stamps that I had found randomly basically, and just got a kind of a nice looking logo on the top. So once I was happy with that, I continued on the blood texturing process. I wanted to tell the story that someone was trying to crawl away from that torture area and they were being dragged back. So getting some bits of getting some of those hands that are provided within the substance painter and just applying them on the area and make it look like they were trying to crawl away, but they were being dragged back onto the torture area was the way that I went with. So I was quite happy with the result. I ended up doing a little bit of an extra kind of a blood detail on other areas as well. We didn't want to make the blood to be just on the floor and the door, so I ended up going through the texture maps and applying that kind of a same blood texture throughout this the other assets. Once I was happy with that, I wanted to add a bit of a randomized splatter blood throughout the areas as well. So what I did was I just made a quick grunge map for that blood, and I got a multiply layer. I made it into a black mask that just covers the entire area, and then using a white brush I was able to unhide all that areas for the blood splatters, just to again randomize that blood, just to get more of a gory type of a look. But I didn't want to overwhelm the main blood areas for where it's being dragged out and stuff. I didn't want to make it just as glossy, so I just lowered the roughness values and made it a little bit darker, just so it wouldn't stand out as much as the other type of blood. And I'm just using that same kind of blood pattern for covering up the walls as well, and getting that extra blood on the torch as well, just like as if a torturer would try to just grab it with their bloody hands or something, and just making again the scene kind of fit the overall design of it being a torture chamber. So then once I was happy with the result for the blood, I wanted to play around with the base and just get the results. Then once I was happy with the overall looks, I want to head back onto the base and switch it up around just a little bit, just again to fit into the scene. Also wanted to highlight a little bit more of those bricks, so I just used a bit of moss just to get it on top of those kind of rocks and to age the overall aesthetics of the scene. Then once I was happy with the result, I ended up exporting everything out and I was ready to be taking this design onto Unreal Engine 5. To set up my assets for Unreal Engine 5, I just went ahead and straight up imported the FBX file which contained all of the assets at once. They were more or less set up the way I wanted them to be, and so right away I just went ahead and imported the textures as well. I made sure that the pack textures for the roughness, ambient occlusion and metallic have sRGB ticked off, because otherwise they wouldn't give us the kind of most accurate results for the PBR texturing, and we obviously don't want that to happen. So afterwards I just went ahead and created a quick material for them. I converted all the texture maps to be parameters so I can easily make instances of that material and just reassign all the texture maps onto them. So I'm right now just opening everything up and just assigning all of those texture maps onto the separate instances. So it's quite a tedious process, but once we get it properly set up, it's quite nice and easy and simple to use. So right now I'm just getting everything out, and when I was happy with that, I just went ahead and made sure that the instances are renamed differently, and afterwards I just went ahead and replaced all the references for the default materials to be using those material instances instead. Sometimes it will give you an error that's saying that, oh, it's not the same format, but all it means is that we're just replacing a material as a material instance, and that'll just work out just fine. So when you're happy with the result, so probably most of the time was just spent getting everything set up and assign us proper kind of textures and whatnot. The rest of the environment was quite easy to do, honestly, and it was quite a simple setup, so I was quite happy with the way it was turning out. So again, I'm just replacing all the necessary assets and trying to make use out of the filters, just so I could see material instances as well as materials all at once, so I wouldn't have to scroll through all the models and meshes and whatnot, and just trying to get my kind of workflow a little bit faster. And in the end, it didn't help us much though, but it's quite a nice functionality to use every once in a while. But again, once I was happy with the assigned materials, I was just checking out, making sure that all the assigned materials are properly set up. And once I was happy with that, I went ahead and quickly changed up the pivot points using modeling mode for the barrels and crates. If you want to use modeling mode, all you gotta do is enable that through the plugins menu found within an edit tab. And once I was happy with it, I just played around with the design, the setup for the crates as well as barrels, and just getting a nice kind of a setup. I wanted the entrance to the door to be kind of more eye-catchy, so I tried to make all the crates and barrels to set up in a way that would be aligning towards the door, so the eye would be naturally drawn towards that door. And basically all the assets kind of, as you can see, the barrel and the crate is just slightly aligned towards that area, just again to catch a little bit more of that attention towards the center of environment, which happens to be the door. So I was playing around with design. Not only was I rotating the crates and barrels, I was also making them slightly smaller and bigger, and this was just to get a little bit more of that variation, because obviously we're having a bit of a kind of a medieval style going for it. All the things are handcrafted, and you wouldn't get perfectly kind of same sized props for the areas, so you'd get more natural look if you'd have some bits small, some bits larger, like so. But obviously we can't make them too big or too small, because otherwise it would look very natural, especially since they're using wood grain. So if we make it too large or too small, that grain is obviously going to be rescaled with the textures, with the UV textured assets as well. And so I'm just only doing it in a minimum kind of a way. In an area where it's the other side of the room, I was able to get away with making it just a little bit more smaller, just so I could fit in extra of those crates in an areas where I want them to be. I wanted to kind of cover up the torture area a little bit, and I wanted to make it a bit more kind of abandoned and chaotic looking. So I just rotated it slightly, made it look like part of the crate is sat not only on the base but also on the side of that torture area. And then I just played around with how they're being laid out as well, so they wouldn't be just completely horizontal, and instead they'd look like they're just barely hanging on that section. And I think it came out really nice, as well as giving us some nice silhouette looks for the environments, the edges of it all. And once I was happy with that, I ended up playing a little bit with the lighting. I deleted all the background area, so all the clouds, all the atmosphere layers, I ended up deleting all of those. And what I did instead, I just got myself a skylight first and made sure it uses a cube map instead of a real-time lighting to get a bit more of an ambient kind of a light. And I think I made it just a little bit more gritty. I think I added a bit of a greenish kind of a tint, and this helped it to really sell that kind of underground area. And then afterwards I ended up playing with direction lights a little bit as well. I really liked the way that direction light was set up for the entrance, but the backside was having a lot of shadows in the back, and I just didn't want that to be the case. So I ended up getting myself a rectangle light a little bit, just to make sure that I'm getting a bit more depth out of it, and that ambient light is definitely kind of shining it through. So obviously we want to light up the torches as well. That's also going to give us a bunch of nice lighting. And I ended up setting up a quick blueprint just to make sure that I'm able to get some light flicker out of it. I had a nice setup already, so I just copied from an astronomy table. If you're interested in that video, you can check it out as well, since it's more or less the same light flicker that I've used over there. I just had to replace the float values just to make sure that the intensity is being switched around. And all it is basically it randomizes the intensity based on a random times, and that way we're able to get different types of flicker, and it just makes it look a little bit more organic as lighting. And I'm just playing around with the values, trying to get the right type of result, changing the tone a little bit, and just seeing how it looks within the scene. And once I was happy with that, I'd be able to make use out of it in the other side as well. So I was trying to get some nice results out of it. And then afterwards I went ahead and quickly created myself a Niagara fluid simulation for the fire. I'm using a 3D fire. It gives a nice result, but it's quite performance heavy. So what I did was I just lowered a little bit of that resolution for this scene, just to make sure that we're not overdoing it in the performance wise. And once I was happy with that, I played around with the scaling as well as the world space size found in the properties tab for this fluid simulation. And by playing around with those two combinations, you're able to kind of scale it down to the way you want it and get the kind of a shape that you want out of this flame. I didn't go into the particle system itself for the details or the options of it, since there was no need. I was kind of getting the results I like out of it already, so there was no need to spend extra time on it. And I just went ahead and continued playing around with the lighting and just trying around how it looks like within the scene. Before doing the lighting though, I forgot to mention that I went ahead and quickly created a post-process effect and just made sure that the exposure is not set as automatic. So minimum exposure and maximum exposure, if they're both set to 1, you'll be getting a default kind of exposure. And that's kind of really important, especially when you're creating darker type of scenes, because sometimes they just randomly brighten up or darken up the environment based on how close you're getting to the light source and whatnot. And it's just too hard to control that within this kind of a small environment that we're creating. So instead what I did, I was just set up a quick exposure with minimum and maximum values, and that seemed to help with this case. So after what's happened then, I wanted to add a bit more gore to this scene. I realized that I have quite a lot of blood on the ground and the walls as well as the door, but for areas like crates, for example, where it's just a duplicate of an asset and they're not unique assets based on location, so I couldn't add blood just randomly throughout those assets. I decided to add it using decals instead. So I just created a quick material with a transparency on them and just applied it on the barrels as well as the area in the back. I decided to add an extra kind of a blood to that as well. Just a quick splatter will do. And I think it definitely brings out the kind of a gore scene out of it. I was trying to figure out whether I may or not I want to add it onto the torture areas as well. And I ended up adding just a little bit because the decals, they just go through all the assets. You can take it off individually on assets, but in this case I like the way it turned out by blood splatter being on the torture device as well a little bit. Makes it look more natural, as if the blood splatter came from that direction. So I left it as is, and then went ahead and quickly played around with the lights again. I ended up deleting directional light from the other side, and instead I just wanted to get some nicer results using the rectangle light. So this way I'll be able to kind of highlight some of that detail that I wanted, and also bring out the lighting using the torches as well. Just make the shadows not too dark using the skylight by increasing its intensity or lowering depending on the exposure as well. I went into both process effects and just made sure that the exposure is a little bit higher. I believe that way I'll be able to get more light out of the shadows, and I just lowered all the lighting intensity throughout the scene. That way I was able to get some nice overall kind of gritty dark look out of this environment. But once I was happy with that, I ended up playing a little bit with attenuation radius for the light sources, for the flickers of those lanterns, as well as the source light, which helps me to soften up the shadows, especially the ones that are closer to the light source. So once I was happy with that, I ended up trying to get a little bit of a nicer gradient for the scene. So what I ended up doing is I just got myself a solid plain color for the background, and I just set it up as a large kind of a square for the base, and adjusted it to be kind of a dark gray. So afterwards with that, I just quickly made myself a light map mask importance, just to make sure that this square is not being included into all the light maps. And once I was with that, I just added a quick exponential fog and played around with that to get some nice gradient. By playing around with its intensity, its opacity, the color for it, as well as the height fall off and the starting distance, you're able to have a kind of a nice control over the gradient for the background of your scene. So by tweaking those values up a little bit, you're able to get some really nice results. The color that I used for the exponential height fog was a kind of a brownish tint, just to bring up that kind of a gritty look for this environment. And afterwards after that, I just ended up playing around a little bit more with the post-process effect. I increased the contrast a little bit, as well as switched up some gamma, just to get a little bit more of those harsh shadows. And I wanted to highlight a little bit of that front door, especially since there's some blood. So I added a really small kind of intensity light to the front of that door, which I think was a subtle way of bringing that blood detail out of it, out of this scene. Since otherwise it's not quite obvious that there is any blood. It was a little bit too dark in that area. We don't want it to make it look too unnatural, so making the direction go in kind of a similar way from where the torch is was a nice way of helping up with that. And again, just making sure that the intensity is quite low and it's just barely touching kind of the ground, just so we wouldn't get any of the additional detail on the areas that we don't want them to be. So once I was happy with that, I went ahead and just quickly checked out the environment again, just how it looks. And actually in the end, for that torch area, I ended up getting some softer shadows using a source light within the blueprint, and just making sure that the shadow from that torch isn't being like covering the entire base of that scene. So all in all, when I was finished with that, I ended up playing around with the shots, and I'm going to set up all the animated camera angles. My first shot, I ended up doing the usual, the one that I like, which is just getting the camera closer, as well as getting the focal length a little bit smaller, but it makes it look as if the depth is being warped around the camera, which is, I think, is a real nice kind of effect to present your environments. So I just made sure that I'm not overdoing it. I'm just making sure that the intensity for it is not too much, so it's just kind of a barely additional kind of effect, just to bring out the depth out of a scene. And once I was happy with that, I ended up creating yet another camera, doing something similar for this camera as well, just making sure I'm presenting both the front and the back of the environment, and just getting the kind of nice shots that I want. So I was playing around with the way I'll have it for this area as well. I wanted to have it to be a little bit more of a frontal shot instead on this one, instead of a sideways kind of a view, because I didn't really want the crates to be covering up that door too much, and I wanted to be using those crate position to be aligning the focus of the door. So I was quite happy with the way this turned out. And afterwards I decided to make a new camera. This time I created a new object and attached it to the camera. I set up an object basically as a focal point, and later on all you gotta do is within the details tab just make sure to turn off the visibility, in-game visibility, that you can just simply click with, which will make it so whenever you press play, it'll just make it disappear from your scene. But having it visible when working with cameras is real nice, so you know exactly where the camera is rotating around, for example, and how the camera is moving within the scene. So it's quite nice to make use out of those kind of ways to just get some nice animation for the shots. Right now I'm just getting some extra close-up rotation shots for the door, the front and the back. I think I've done both of them because I quite like the way one side as well as the other side is having a similar kind of design, but it just has a different gore kind of a look out of it. Without the blood on the bottom of the front of the door, you wouldn't even think that it is the entrance to sort of a torture chamber, and it would make it look like some sort of a storage room. So it makes it look as if the place is somewhat hidden even. So it's just quite a nice way of telling, I'd say, even like a story. Everyone that ends up getting into this kind of place are kind of forgotten by the world itself, and it's just I think it's a nice kind of a gritty background kind of a story. So again, I'm just playing around, doing more or less the same. Since I had the cameras attached to the pivot points, they're going to be following the rotation, the transformation of those angles of those pivot points, and we're just making use out of them. Whenever I want the camera to go backwards, I just select the camera itself, make sure that the gizmo is set to local transformation, and just bring in the camera back a little bit or front, depending on how close or how far away I want the camera to be. So having those kind of basic motions, you're able to get some really nice animations, and with just simple clicks and simple transitions between them, you're able to make some nice presentations for the environment. And once I was happy with that, I played around a little bit with the focal lens as well, just trying to figure out how to set up final shots. And the final shot that I wanted to do was obviously a turntable. There's no way you can have kind of a small environment without a turntable. Just to show around the entire kind of a scene for your project, you obviously want to show everything that you have within that area from all the perspectives. And you just gotta make sure that the motion you're setting it up is set to linear. By right-clicking on the transformations, you can change them to be linear, and all it'll do is just make sure that the motion, the rotation is constant, and it doesn't just slow down or speed up at the front and end. And with that, I pretty much had all the shots I wanted. And that's going to be it, guys. So for the modeling part, it uses a lot of techniques, and it is a decent level even though the scene is small. I wouldn't recommend this building for beginners unless you are really determined. If you look at each of the parts separately, you can see that a lot of various techniques are used, and a good understanding of modeling is essential to build this. If we, for example, look at how the wall was created using the modifier stacking, and then look at the torch holder, we can see the variation. So all in all, I will be giving this scene a solid 7 out of 10, and the only piece really missing from this would be things like edge wear and perhaps a little more detail, but apart from that, these scenes are pretty much what you'd find in games like Skyrim. And in order to texture the scene, there were used a lot of gritty textures, which honestly is not too hard to make in this case, as long as you add additional noise to the textures using masks. If the mask themselves has grunge maps with high contrast, but look too chunky, I just had to upscale the textures themselves, and it just gave me some really nice noise. I would say for a beginner it might be hard though, with getting all the overall detail to fit with one another, especially when painting some blood textures, since I had to go from one material to another and make sure it has a certain flow that tells a sort of a story, and it is why I'm giving it a 5 out of 10, as it was a rather small scene and not many texture variations had to be made. So as long as you had good base material to work with, you'd be fine. Now, majority of the environment was already set up, since to get more of a custom look, I had to make sure everything is kind of stuck together, except for the crates, that is. And it wasn't hard to make an environment out of it. I've set up basic PBR material and assigned the textures with them. The torches use a default Niagara fluid simulation for the fire, which you can enable from the plugin menu, which was super easy to set up as I didn't adjust much the parameters. I just had to make sure to play around with some scaling parameters just for a bit to get the right results. There were some decals that were used to get some additional environment detail, but they weren't complex to create. I will say this though, they are performance heavy and I would recommend you not to overuse them and only make sure you use them when necessary. In this section, probably the most complex part was tweaking out the values for lighting, which can be hard for the beginners as each scene requires its own unique tweak of values. But that skill comes with practice, and it is definitely necessary, especially when you're lightening up a darker sort of environment. All in all, I will give this part of a scene a 3 out of 10 in terms of difficulty, as it was relatively easy to set up. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this video for a stylized Skyrim style dungeon scene. Make sure to give us a like if you did, and don't forget to drop a comment down below of what you would like us to do next. Also, check out the links down below to see the massive library of courses we have available, which are free to anyone that signs up for the Patreon. We also have some free goods on our Gumroad, things like texture packs and some models for anyone to download. And that'll be all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.